Welcome to the Education Corner, a podcast by Education Choices magazine.
Education Corner podcast would like to welcome Michael Rosen, children's author and former children's laureate. Michael Rosen is a children's author, poet, presenter, political columnist, broadcaster, activist, and academic. He was Children's Laureate from 2007 to 2009 and has written over 200 books for children and adults, including the beloved classic, We're Going on a Bear Hunt. Alongside this, Michael works to promote and support causes he feels passionate about, including promoting poetry and literacy among young people. It's such a pleasure to have you with us. Firstly, could you tell us a little bit about your background and your work as a writer?
Yes, so as far as my background is concerned, I was born in 1946, brought up in northwest London. My parents, by the time I was about two, they were both teachers. My father had trained during the Second World War. My mum did emergency training, as it was called, in that period immediately after the war when they found they were short of many, many teachers in schools. So I had a very kind of educational background, if you like. They themselves had a background in the East End of London. They were both Jewish. My father had actually been born in the States, my mum in the East End of London. That's where they grew up. But my background was in the northwest London suburb of Pinner, which was a very interesting, varied thing in some ways. I went to state schools. I went to two primary schools, two secondary schools, then went to university. First, I started studying medicine, which I found was a bit of a mistake. So I studied English instead. And then by then I'd been writing. I'd been writing plays and stories and sketches. People might be familiar with things like the Footlights and people like Michael Palin and that sort of thing. Well, I did the equivalent at another university. Lots of sketches and plays, that sort of thing. And was writing poems. I had a play that got put on at the Royal Court when I was still a student, Royal Court Theatre in London. But all the time writing poems, and some of these found their way via my mother, would you believe, on BBC Schools Radio, and then I gathered those up, and my first book for children came out in 1974, which was a book of poems illustrated by Quentin Blake, called Mind Your Own Business, and that had poems that I still perform to this day. And once you write a children's book, you enter the world of children's books, which is very welcoming and kind if you want it to be. And I found it extraordinary. Just I was suddenly invited places to read my poems. And that then provided a kind of accelerator. I was just on this wonderful roundabout and haven't stopped since.
Many of your books focus on your early childhood and the experience of childhood. What led you to want to become a children's author and focus on these topics?
Well, it was quite strange, really. What happened was that two things were happening at the same time. One was that a man called Geoffrey Summerfield, people might know of him, certainly older people anyway. He produced two series, wonderful series of poetry anthologies for schools, Voices and Junior Voices, and he was a friend of my parents. And he laid out the anthology on our living room floor. And there were my parents and him and me were reading these poems. And amongst those were some poems by an American poet, not very well known in this country, called Carl Sandburg, but all sorts of other poets. And I remember thinking that somehow or other, this was a voice that I wanted to imitate, particularly Carl Sandburg, who could write about conversations between parents and kids, between kids and kids, in a very accessible and colloquial way. And then simultaneously with that, I was reading the autobiography, sort of autobiography, by James Joyce called Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And in that book, he writes about his childhood in the voice of a child. I mean, it begins once upon a time, as if somehow or other he's telling a fairy story about himself. And I like that idea of writing about your childhood in the voice of a child. And obviously other poets have done the same before me, most famously Robert Louis Stevenson and A.M. Milne. who I probably read at school rather than at home. So somewhere around about the age of 16, I started writing about my childhood in the voice of a child. But I never thought it was necessarily interesting for children. But bit by bit, partly because of my mum doing these BBC Schools radio programmes, and partly because I'd got my play published by Faber's, that I started hawking this little pile of poems I had, which were about my childhood and having fun with my brother and my friends. And then suddenly, publisher Pam Royds at a little independent publisher called Andre Deutsch in London decided that they liked these, and that's how that first collection came about.
On your website, you talk about diverse childhood and the many different languages and cultures you were exposed to, including family members who were immigrants from Poland, Russia, and Romania, and that you spoke languages such as Yiddish, French, German, and Latin. How do you think this diversity and exposure to different cultures impacted you and your work throughout your life?
Very hard to piece together, isn't it? If you have a background where you not only speak the same exactly identical language as your parents or as your friends, but there are other language influences, it feels so natural. You don't know that it's necessarily unusual or that you're being affected by it. So yes, my parents, one word that people have used is Yinglish. That's to say that they mixed English up with Yiddish in ways that I didn't even really necessarily understand. I just thought they were speaking, but then I knew that there were these words that my friends didn't understand, but I did, at least some of them. Like a word for a drying up cloth, like a schmutter. It seemed like, if I even say it now, I think when I look at a drying up cloth, I don't think it's a drying up cloth. I think it's a schmutter. So you have the terminology, but also all sorts of expressions about, about eating or about ways of going on that my parents would use. And bit by bit, I began to discover that was the language that belonged to them and their parents and their parents' parents. And then at the same time, we often went to France. And way back in the early 50s, that was quite unusual, actually, particularly as we didn't have a car. So we used to have to go by train and boat and bus and so on. And I remember coming back to school when I was, I think the first time we went, it was in 1951. So I would only have been 5. And then the next time in 1953, so I'd have only been 7. And none of my friends had been abroad. And it was thought to be like something terribly posh, but in fact, it was very unposh because we just went on a train and a boat and then with a tent and camped on camping sites. So there was nothing kind of particularly posh about it. But I was immediately immersed in total Frenchness on those holidays. And then meanwhile, my father in particular, he loved playing with languages. He had learnt German in the army because he was in the occupying, the American army. He was born in the States, my dad. He was in the occupying army in Berlin. So he often used to say things in German and he sang songs in German. He loved German songs. And then also he had studied Latin. So by the time I was 12, I was inducted into this. So I was studying French, German and Latin at school myself. So when you've got that feeling about languages, that, as I've just described it, you don't think of language as transparent. If I say table, and if you say table to a child, there's a way in which they think that the word and the thing are the same. But if you know there are other words for table, like Tisch in German, well, then suddenly you realize that words and things are separate. And the moment you have that objectivity about words, it makes you play with language in certain ways, maybe just in your head, or if you start writing, then you suddenly feel that you're making choices about language. And that's very much in your head, that language is for you to choose and play with and decide how you'll use it. I mean, I'm not saying that monolingual people can't write, far from it. Of course they can. But it's just that if you have that sense about language, then there's a certain freedom.
We are particularly highlighting Christmas books in this edition and your latest book coming out, Bar Humbug, which is a modern retelling of Dickens' A Christmas Carol. What inspired you to create a modern version of this story, and what do you hope young readers take away from it?
Well, I've already described the idea of playing. And the thing about all these books that we have, this great vast millions of books of the past, whether you go back 2,000, 3,000 years to the Odyssey or the Epic of Gilgamesh or to a book that came out last week, these are all things we can obviously read and immerse ourselves in and have fun with, but we can also play with them. And if you think about movies and so on, if you know all sorts of ways in which Hollywood and others have taken old stories and then played with them. So I was sitting down with an editor at Scholastic, and we were talking about playing with books that already existed, and we came up with Christmas Carol. And we were talking about it, and in a way, you know, it's what we would now give a completely different name to it, call it magical realism. But of course, Dickens didn't know that. I think he was writing a ghost story. Good luck to him. And it was also a social commentary, and it's very powerful in that way because you know, we see the movement of this miserly old bloke from being quite awful, really, into somebody who's changed. And change, this is something that fiction shows beautifully. It can show people changing, and that's partly what makes fiction so inspiring sometimes. You think a person can change or a group of people can change. And we see that with Scrooge because he's confronted with himself. And that's what's so painful for him, and what might turn out to be, spoiler alert. It's always fun, and in a way, you're what's called privileging. You give children who read a book that if they've got one foot, they'll have known either the Muppets Christmas Carol or some other Christmas carols, and then to play with it, it gives, in a way, you give children, young readers, a sense of, oh, I know what this is about. Oh, yes. And then they play a game of spotting the differences and the parallels and the allegories and and so on. So that's what I thought we were doing with that. And so I created a situation that was a parallel rather than a retelling. It's a kind of parallel story in which someone realizes that basically he's lost all that he's got by being mean and mean rather than miserly, I think, in the story. But it's his meanness and estrangement from his family. So I wanted that to be a modern feeling about it. And while we're on it, I did something similar with Macbeth, which was called Macbeth United, about the story of Macbeth done through a boys' football team. And again with Oliver Twist, with a book called Unexpected Twist. So I've had three goes at this sort of parallel writing, which I hope, as I say, makes the child reader think, ah, I'm immersed in something that I'm kind of familiar with, and I'm playing a game here. So it's a sort of, yeah, it's a bit like those game books that you can get where you play with the plot. That they can see I'm playing with the plot, so it's an invitation for them to as well.
Much of your work has focused on instilling a love of reading, something which is increasingly important in a time where digital devices are very prevalent, and 1 in 10 children aged between 5 and 18 do not have a book of their own at home. Why do you feel it's so important to promote literacy, and what more can parents and teachers be doing to support this?
I think the thing about reading is that it requires a particular slow, reflective way of absorbing ideas and feelings. So, you know, I'm not against film, I'm not against digital communications by any means. I have at least one foot in those areas as well. And I love going to the cinema, I love watching TV dramas and going online. I think there's something particular about a book in that this thing that I'm talking about, I mean, slow sounds trivial, but it isn't really because the advantage of slowness is that you have a time to reflect and predict and wonder and memorize and gather up what it is that you've already read and thought about. You can quickly flick back and find things. So that reading experience has got a slightly different quality. And I think that's to be treasured. And for young children, there's another thing, which is with the picture book, the illustrated book, is that a fantastic thing goes on where the child synthesizes processes words and pictures at the same time. Quite often a very young child is hearing a picture book through their ear with parent carer reading the story, while the child looks at the pictures. Now the pictures, we often use this word illustrated, but in actual fact I think that's quite often misleading, because the pictures really, they're telling another story. So just to take one example, take like Where the Wild Things Are. If you look at the cover of Where the Wild Things Are, you let's say you read that to the child. You say, this book is called Where the Wild Things Are. And then you look at the cover, and there's one wild thing, so there aren't two, there's only one. And it seems to be rather dozy. It's sitting under a tree and kind of got its head sort of tucked into its chest. And so you hear wild, and then you see this thing that's dozing. And so immediately, you just take that as one example, or many, as you go through a book, of a child having to synthesize differences, contrasts, complementary things about how words and pictures don't completely match. Or if you take the book that you've mentioned, We're Going on a Bear Hunt, Helen Oxenbury has created a set of stories about those characters and the dog, which tell their own story. I mean, if you want to, you can go through that book and tell the story of the baby. Or if you want to, you could go through that book and tell the story of the dog, or any of those children, any of the people in the book, or indeed anything about the landscape. So all that is not really illustrating, telling those stories. So there's the words that seem to be telling one story, and the pictures are telling something that's related but not the same as. So there's a wonderful, I'd say it's intellectual, that a child has to do to make it work, to make meaning out of it. So one way or another, books, whether they're ones where we just look at print and pull the meaning out of the page, the way we do once we know how to read, or picture books where we're synthesizing, I think that's a very important process, and you know, it's worth it. Now, it's hard to necessarily to put your finger on it exactly, but I think there is some level at which that's to do with reasoning. I think the process of reading requires you to, I call it harvesting, gather up what you've read and make it match the thing that you're reading now. And at the same time, we can't stop ourselves predicting. I've already mentioned that. So you gather, you read now, and you predict. And that's quite an intellectual exercise. I think that's something, you know, that at the heart of it is something to do with logic. I mean, people talk in terms of comprehension at schools and they call it inference. And we infer, but in order to infer, we have to harvest, we have to gather up, and with the inference we predict. And we don't have to necessarily close it down as saying we're only making one kind of inference. We're probably making lots and lots of open-ended inferences right from the very start of a book. I mean, the beginning of Hamlet is two guys on the battlements of a castle who say, "Who's there?" And depending on what kind of stage setting you have, whether there's sort of misty stuff and strange creaky noises going on, you might sit up in your seat and go, "Yeah, who is there? Will we find out? And will we ever find out in this play who's there, and what's going on?" So, you know, books are full of curiosities and things that are half revealed and half concealed, and that kind of effort that goes on is I think it's probably quite important for our development, but exactly how is to a large extent speculation, but I say it's valuable.
Much of your work focuses on poetry, which is often overlooked by many young readers. Why does poetry appeal to you, and why do you feel it's so important for young people to develop an understanding and enjoyment of it?
I think one of the great things about poetry is its flexibility. So if you just think of the whole history of poetry, there are hundreds and hundreds of different ways to write poems. And so when we come to children with poems, it's one of the things we can say, so that whereas when we're teaching children standard English and standard prose, the form is quite contained and controlled within these sentences that we teach children what are sentences and so on. Whereas poetry doesn't have to do that. You know, it could be at the level of sound. It can have rhythm, rhyme, and repetition if it wanted to, or it could be fragmentary. It doesn't have to obey the ordinary rules of syntax. You can have list poems. It can be dreamy, or it can be very, very formal. You know, it can follow the shape of a limerick or a sonnet or a ballad, and be quite formal along those lines too. And one of the other aspects of poetry that I think is important for children is that it can be something that sounds like a contradiction. It can be like oral writing. So obviously writing isn't oral and oral can't be writing. So it's a bit of a joke on my part. But what I mean by that is that we can encapsulate in poems our speaking voices, and whether we do that in dialogue form, which of course you can do in fiction as well, but in dialogue form, or you can take your own voice and so make a poem so it's like a monologue, or, you know, thinking of Shakespeare, a soliloquy, or Robert Browning, the dramatic monologue, or it can be the monologue of somebody else. So it can be your monologue. I went for a walk, you know, I wandered lonely as a cloud. That's almost like a dramatic monologue, that. And it can be in the present tense. You could say, I am wandering like a cloud. So that gives it an immediacy, a bit like a sort of football commentary, like you're actually there. And then you can also put that in the voice of somebody else. So you could write a monologue from the point of view of your mum or your dad or your brother or your sister, or an animal, a cat, or indeed a tree, or a glass of water. And that's a very attractive flexibility again. So fiction can play with these things, but obviously they're in the context of plots and longer forms. But the great thing about poetry as well is it can, if you want it to be, very short. You can have long poems, you can have short poems. So there is this wonderful flexibility about it. The trouble is that quite often in our experience, particularly as teachers, is that some of our experience of poetry was quite humiliating. We sort of got the impression that, you know, we were dolts and that we didn't understand a poem. And once you've got that sense that, oh dear, the poem, oh, that's going to be difficult, or I won't understand it, or there's somebody who knows more about it than I do. But the moment you have that experience, then you don't feel at ease with it. So, you know, there's lots of shapes and forms of poetry that you can find you can be at ease with. You only have to go to weddings and funerals, and you see people quite often reach out for poems in order to express something in that moment. Why do they go to poems? Is it because they condense feeling in a particular way? Is it an essence that they want there? Is it because it's putting into words feelings that you yourself find difficult to find? So though poetry can seem daunting, in actual fact, people very often turn to it in these moments of difficulty or high elation. You know, office parties, saying goodbye to the person who's leaving, and somebody writes a funny ballad. You know, all these are valid and terrific forms. And then you get highly popular poets who suddenly pop up. I say suddenly, you know, you think of Pam Ayres for the last 40, 50 years. You know, she's been able to express wonderful ideas through a particular kind of comic verse, and others like Benjamin Zephaniah have been on television doing their poetry, or then Warsan Shire, I think, in TED Talks, and so on. So poetry doesn't keep popping up, and you could argue that people like Stormzy or Cat Burns and people like that, they're writing a kind of poetry and music that is sort of one foot in the music world, one foot in the poetry world. That's what I would argue anyway.
Each year, Michael Rosen Day is celebrated on the 13th of November to promote creativity, reading, writing. And this year, over 200,000 children took part. Could you tell us a little bit more about Michael Rosen Day and what led to its creation and what its aims are?
Yes. Well, it came as a bit of a surprise to me. It wasn't something I invented. It was a very nice guy called Ben O'Donnell, who has worked in the world of children's books and with publishers. And I think it was Ben who cooked it up with Walker Books and said, why don't we have a Michael Rosen Day? And of course, my first reaction was no. You know, no, they said, you can't do that. You know, it's sort of a bit egotistical. And the way I've kind of resolved that little problem was to say that, well, it must be something very inclusive and something that involves children in reading and writing in ways that we think up. That must be fun and engaging for teachers, parents, and children. And so now I'm talking about the purpose of it. So that's our idea, really. That each year I'm a catalyst. So I'll share my poems and have fun with them, but at the same time inviting children to write or to read other poems other than mine. So this year we had a theme of funny food, and I've discovered that I've written quite a few funny food poems. I thought I'd only written about two. So it was lovely to find those, so having a little expedition through my own poems. So there was that aspect. And then inviting children to write their own poems. We had a competition, and their poems, the winning poems, were just superb. I mean, I had great fun reading those out. So I wanted that. That's exactly what I want the day to be, for it to show that you can write poems. I'm not the only person that can write poems, obviously, but you folks, young folks, you can write poems and listen to these wonderful poems that you've written. So that seemed to me to express what I thought Michael Rosen Day could be about.
On your website, you also say, my parents were very, very, very interested in education, schools, learning, and books. They were very keen that my brother and I should do well at school. But at the same time, I have to say, they were very funny, humorous people who loved jokes, stories, and songs. Why do you feel that a balance between seriousness and fun is so important? And how has it impacted your work?
Yes, indeed, you've expressed it. I'm not sure I've got all that much to add, but absolutely, they were both in their own way scholars, and they were both in their own way storytellers. Loved having fun with words, loved singing, loved songs, loved listening to other people telling stories. So I had these sort of two things going on at the same time: scholarliness and what do we call this other thing? A form of popular culture. This idea that we can convey thoughts and feelings through jokes and songs and stories. And so these two things have run parallel. And also my mum, I can remember reading to me from the age of naught. Well, I can't remember the naught bit, but certainly from about 3 onwards. And my dad reading to me when I was older, to us, reading Catch-22, Great Expectations, Catcher in the Rye, Guy Mannering, Christmas Carol, I think. Oh, I know, Dylan Thomas, A Child's Christmas. So, I had all these things going on, as well as we were quite fanatical about listening to radio. There was something called Children's Hour on the radio, which had stories and serials of books dramatized, and also programs of poems. So a lot of that was going on in my childhood. In that sense, I was incredibly lucky, but I do very much treasure the fact that there's an arc that goes from my parents' scholarliness. They both wrote scholarly things. My mum died at 56, so she was just beginning to write things about education. She wrote a very scholarly book with my dad, called The Language of Primary School Children, which involved a lot of theory about language and so on. So you can see there's a sort of scholarly end there. And my dad went on to write books about language and literature. He was a professor at Institute of Education in London, University of London. But at the same time, he loved a silly story, loved a joke, and constantly singing silly songs. I know an old bloke, and his name is Lord Jim, and he's got a wife who throws tomatoes at him. Now, tomatoes are juicy, don't injure the skin, but these ones they did. They were inside a tin. Da, 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 da. Just a silly, lots of us have got memories of our mums and dads singing silly songs. Well, I suppose my parents, they kind of almost made it into an art form. We went camping a lot, and, every night we sat around a campfire and sang songs. Some of them very, very silly. And he sat down beside her and smoked his cigar, these sorts of things. And it kind of goes into your head, that sort of stuff, and never goes away. And silly rude poems about Michael. You ought to see Michael make water. It makes a most beautiful stream. It runs for a mile and a quarter, and you can't see poor Michael for steam. So, that's if you were peeing in the hedge at the back of the campsite. I don't know whether he made that one up or not. I think my dad was always trying to make up limericks, and he'd make up limericks around people's names. There was an old man called, as well as there wasn't an old man from. and so he'd make those up. And so, yeah, you've got the two things running side by side, and I guess I've inherited that and value that, and you can see that, I guess, in my work, which kind of veers at one moment quite scholarly. So I did a book called Adventures in Wonderland. There's my lectures in children's literature at Goldsmiths, University of London. These are my lectures on the master's course that I teach, and that's all very scholarly. At the same time, I make up a poem like Down Behind the Dustbin, I met a dog called Jim. He didn't know me, and I didn't know him. And a kid, one school shouted out, "Well, how did you know his name was Jim then?" And I said, "I don't know. I don't know." And I now say, "Well, it's completely ruined the poem for me because I've never found out how I knew his name was Jim." It's a terrible disaster. I used to like that poem. Anyway, just kidding. So look, that's I very, very much owe that to my parents.
Early in your career, you worked as a teacher and you have spent lots of time visiting schools and working with young people and teachers since then. What advice would you give to teachers or students who are working on building a love of reading and writing?
Well, the thing that you just described, that moment of contact when you share a story with someone else. I mean, I hesitate to use the word magic, but because it feels a bit magical in the sense that when you watch a magician, and they hide the card and you can't kind of work out how it's done. In a way, it is a bit like that when somebody reads to you and these images come into your head of the story, and you're sitting there, and the person reading to you, they're there, their voice is doing it and making it, but there's a way in which they disappear and you're in the story. I mean, I can remember very, very vividly all sorts of storytelling moments from my primary school. And it's aside from my parents, who of course were teachers as well. So, for example, my head teacher at my first primary school used to tell the Bible stories. Aside from the fact that I was utterly terrified by some of them, she used to walk up and down on the school stage and sometimes had a blackboard and drew pictures on it, and other times just gave out these stories, and she knew them, so she wasn't actually reading them. And she would be staring at us and telling us the story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and his, as we now say, his multicolored dream coat, and these stories, and Benjamin. Do they put him down the well? Poor Benjamin. Anyway, I've sort of remembered some of them. And I remember, for example, her telling the story of Gideon, who had to choose who was going to come with him, and he gave this test that he watched how people went to the river and drank water. And she said, I remember her saying to us, how did he choose? What would you do? How would you drink water from the river? And I thought, oh goodness, will I be able to go? And I remember thinking, that's me. I'm one of those people. So there was this magical moment when I was there in the story. And then she explained that Gideon only took those people with him who cupped their hands and then made a cup of the water and drank from their hands. And the people who drank straight from the river, he didn't take with him. And I remember thinking, oh no, I'd have bent down and I wouldn't have made a cup with my hands. And I remember feeling the story in my guts, or as you'd say in Yiddish, in your kishkas. And I sort of have that sense that that story was about me, even though, it was a Bible story from thousands of years ago. So, that kind of storytelling is incredibly powerful when somebody can make a story matter to you as what was I? It must be before I was 7, because I moved school, so I must have been either 6 years old or 7. And this difficult story about Gideon and who he's going to take with him. Or again, Miss Goodall, that was Miss Stafford, Miss Goodall in my next school reading us Emil and the Detectives, and so desperately thinking I was Emil and his dilemmas, because he's been a naughty boy and painted the statue of the Archduke, that he's in a terrible situation, and then something else happens to him. Spoiler alert, he loses his money and he thinks it's that man who's sitting in the corner of the train carriage. And I remember just thinking, that's me, because we often used to travel by train, and sometimes on my own or with my brother. And so I just sort of felt, oh goodness, that is so me. The fact that the author is able to play with the child's sense of guilt and danger and peril, jeopardy. So I loved that. And then again, head teacher Mr. Scotney, coming in last thing every Friday afternoon and reading us what I now know is a novelisation of a film. It's called Hue and Cry. The film's a very good film, actually. It's a sort of realist film, a bit like Emily and the Detective, set in the bomb-damaged London in 1948. But the novelisation is he read to us, and I remember what he used to do was he read a chapter, and then we'd go, "Yeah, we'll carry on, sir," and then he'd snap the book like this. He'd get to the end of the chapter, and he'd go, and then put it over there like that. And we go, "No, go on, sir, go on." And he wouldn't, you see. He'd like tease us. And he'd walk out. And he had a very kind of upright, sort of clicky shoes, the upright way of walking and clicky shoes. So I can see him sort of going, and then walking out with a little sort of smiley face. And of course, we then had a week in which to interpret the story. So we had a week in which we argued about what would happen next and what happened then. So it wasn't this thing of a story and then you've immediately got to comprehend it and say, retrieval and inference and chronology and presentation, all that stuff. Instead, we were free in the story to inhabit it and play it out in all sorts of ways. And then, of course, as you walk through the door Friday afternoon, what's going to happen? We're just absolutely sort of desperate to get into it. And it was wonderful, absolutely wonderful experience. And and I'm just taking those examples. I could give you others of teachers and my own parents, as I say, who were both parents and teachers. Well, I'd say to teachers who are listening to this, anyway, many of you know it. I hear wonderful stories of you reading, let's say, Matilda, to a class of children. The children helpless with laughter and horror and amazement. A story like Matilda that's so well constructed. But there are many, many stories out there. I mean, I remember when that London Eye Mystery book came out. Superbly constructed, beautiful story. Or indeed, for older children, A Monster Calls. I mean, brilliant, brilliant story. And the key thing is to find it, and find ways of engaging your students. It might be reading short bits, not trying to read for too long, or it might be that you invite the students out in some way or another to participate in it. You have to, touch it and find out. I mean, I've spent more than 50 years finding out ways of bringing a poem to an audience. Sometimes it's sort of, I pretend I'm not bringing it to them at all and I'm just chatting, and then it slides into the poem. Other times it's, here is a poem, and then I do it, and playing with lots of variants on it. And of course, there's the way in which you deliver it. The key thing about delivery of stories is not to rush it too much, and also to trust the writer. Writers are working very, very hard. I sometimes call them hooks. They create hooks in their texts to get you hooked, literally. So if you think about Emily and the Detectives, it's got these little vignettes in them, in the book, where you have a little sideshow where you look into Emile's life, and they're lovely digressions and they're quite ironic and funny. Well, you can do that yourselves with stories. You can sort of take a little pause and have a little ironic reflection. So you don't have to think necessarily of the book as a slab that you've kind of got to get through. There may be different ways of experimenting with it. You can read a chapter and then invite the children to do mimes, or remember it and come back next week and put on a little bit of it and have fun with it, in other words, and then read the next bit. And sometimes you may not even have to read the whole book. You may say, well, you may want to try and get hold of this book yourselves. Or of course, if you've got class sets, which used to be very much a thing, but less so these days, and then you can hold back the class set and then give them the class set after you've teased them with it. Play around with the idea.
Finally, what are your hopes for the future of children's literature and the next generation's love of reading?
Well, from the publisher's point of view, I can see them experimenting, trying things out, and publishing more and more. I mean, they're publishing stuff at an incredible rate, and there's an economic reason for that. I mean, where publishers are at is that they're sort of publishing books nearly like the way people used to publish magazines, that there's a shortish shelf life to most of them that they accept. It's only one or two that become bestsellers. So in a way, you have to kind of keep your eyes open. But publishers are publishing lots of books. You know, it's healthy. A lot of people are writing books. They're coming up with lots of different ideas. There's some that are just very funny and silly, and some that are, you know, very lengthy. And, you know, what have I got here? It doesn't come bigger than this, does it? Um, look at
Gosh,
that.
yeah.
You know, so it doesn't come bigger than that. And at the same time, you've got,
And so well written.
so you've got somebody like Stephen Mangan, and I don't mean to, you know, it's called something like, you know, The Fart That Killed the World or something. I forgot what it's called now, but or The Worst Fart There Ever Was or something. So you've got, you know, from totally silly to massive, what are in effect Philip, you know, Philip is a philosopher, who is a philosopher, writer, philosopher. So he's thought through a whole load of ideas. And, you know, in case that feels terribly forbidding, I mean, so was C.S. Lewis when he wrote Narnia. I mean, there was a philosophy behind it, you know, by and large Christianity. So, you know, we don't have to be ashamed of that. That's what goes into books, people's ideas and thoughts. And Philip is a fantastic representative of that tradition. And as I say, at the same time, there are these very fun, silly, popular books, which are terrific as well. They tickle us, and you know, if you take Dogman and Captain Underpants from Dav Pilkey, or indeed, you know, the Wimpy Kid guy, Jeff Kinney, you know, these books are, and Liz Pichon with Tom Gates, you know, these are very, very funny, silly books and very clever. I remember reading the Mr. Gum books to my daughter when they first came out, and her just peeling with laughter, absolutely loving them, and reading those to her. It's quite funny actually, as I remember it. She wanted them read to her more than she read them to herself, and that was sometimes that we do like that. We'll read some books to ourselves, and some books we like read to. Anyway, so that's all the publishers' end. From the reading end, I welcome the fact that the government has had this curriculum review and are taking their feet off the pedal with some of the testing. At least that's the vibes they're giving us, because I think that the pressure of the testing and the pressure on this very prescriptive attitude to writing has not helped at all. It's turned language into a chore, and also is utterly misleading. You know, writing is not about using a set of formulae plucked from a set of vague grammatical terms that, you know, may or may not be true anyway. And the idea that, you know, good writing is an expanded noun phrase, or good writing is a fronted adverbial, or good writing is an embedded relative clause, or good writing is a sentence with 3 subordinate clauses in it. All this is complete nonsense. You know, good writing is stuff that moves us. Good writing is stuff that matters. And you may do that in many, many different ways. And, you know, if you just put on a different hat instead of the education hat, we know that. You know, good writing might be Bette Midler singing The Rose, or it might be, you know, a film script. Film script doesn't behave according to the rules of embedded relative clauses and expanded noun phrases. A film script, you know, telling something that moves us, is a completely different way of writing. So, you know, we shouldn't deceive ourselves or deceive children with this stuff. And so I hope that, you know, there'll be a relaxing of those constraints, so that we can once again find our way to language that matters, language that means, language that affects us, language that we can find ourselves in, find other people in. So, you know, language is great for showing us the other, the people we're not, showing us, affirming us, you know, do two things at the same time. It can frighten us, scare us. It can make us brave, make us feeble, and wondrous. You know, all these things. You know, we talk about it all being, say, in Shakespeare. Well, you know, this should be. You know, you think of how Shakespeare can be silly and tragic and funny and moving, and about love and about death, all these sort of different things. Well, you know, we should have the same attitude to children, that we can children's literature, and have that kind of experience should be available to children in a much more free way than is at the moment constrained by, in particular, the Key Stage 2 SATs, I think. And I'm a bit disconcerted that they've suddenly decided they need another test for, year 8s. They've got GCSEs, and I'm somebody who thinks that GCSEs are becoming redundant anyway because there's so much education going on 16 to 18. Why do you need an exam? It's not it's not a leaving exam as it was in my day. The importance of O levels, as they were in my day, was that it was for many people the thing you left and went into the world with, but it isn't anymore. So there's a strong argument, not just from people like me, but all sorts of people saying that, well, we should think of education 14 to 18 as a unit in itself. It doesn't need a great big national testing thing costing millions and millions of pounds every year, and squashing the curriculum into GCSE sized gobbets. Don't need to do that. So right the way through, you can find that the constraints that have been put on the curriculum and on teachers, they're not actually necessary. So to hear about this new year 8 reading test, you think, well, a simpler thing would be that you could say that, it's expected that teachers will do pencil and paper, as we used to call them, pencil and paper checks on reading, and we don't need a national test for year 8s. And that can be part, it can be put, again, light touch. It is expected that that's what teachers will do. But teachers do it anyway. I mean, they have to know how well the students are reading, because in order to find out what they need next. I mean, it's like a whole circularity about it that really, just think the idea that why do you have to create a whole new apparatus costing millions of pounds in order to do this? It treats teachers as sort of, I don't know, dogs in a sleigh, that they get on, horses pulling a coach or something, as opposed to entrusting them with the work that they want to do, which is to advance children's lives. That's what most people are going to teaching. They're not going into it in order to cheat children out of education. They've gone into it because they believe in education. I think I'm going to take some stuff to students, to young children, whatever age, and they're going to make something of this. And that's what I'm really interested in. And the whole apparatus of exams is treating teachers as if secretly they're trying to prevent children from getting something. So it's only the exam system that can make teachers change their minds and interest children. I mean, it's an absurdity, particularly as exams, more often than not always, but more often than not, are quite off-putting for children, I mean, in my case, some of them were off-putting and some of them were lovely, but that's another matter.
It's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and we're so thrilled to have had you on our podcast. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Thanks very much. Thank you, Chloe.